to continue our discussion on a potential coming socialism to the United States and some concepts that come out of 1984 and George Orwell. We have some definitions we need to go over because uh, you need to understand them in the context and the way I'm using them. And to be clear, I'm using some overgeneralizations on purpose because each one of these items is easily a couple-hour video on its own. We need to talk a little bit about fascism and National Socialism. Now, these two ideologies, fascism being an Italian form of socialism, National Socialism being the German form of socialism that occurred leading up to and into World War II. The left are very adamant that fascism and National Socialism weren't actually socialism because they're using some weasel words to get their way out of it. So as we discussed in the previous video, socialism predates Marx. But so Marx was the first one to implement a systemic way of getting to the communist form of socialism. So many people believe that Marx's description of socialism and how you get there is the only valid way of saying it. So if you don't do it the Marxist way, it's not actually socialism, which is wrong because Marx did not create socialism. He just created a theory that might get you there. So Marx believed that in order to get to socialism, you had to have class conflict and you had to have a war between the classes. What the National Socialists of Germany decided was that class conflict was not going to get you to socialism. In fact, the problem was race conflict. And we won't get into that into a deep way, but essentially all the National Socialists did was change the methodology of how you get to socialism. Fascism and National Socialism share some attributes because they're both socialism. However, fascism is quite different in how it's implemented and their general thought process. Whereas National Socialism, a racial content is essentially the core element of their socialism. Fascism did not have that. And the fact that the two are often conflated is an artifact of pro-Soviet propaganda during and following World War II. Now, the key thing we need to walk away with in terms of National Socialism and fascism is that as the system stood in the 30s and 40s was not the end goal. And this is something that confuses people. So if you looked at fascism and National Socialism on the economic side in, say, 1940, you would have seen a system where there were only maybe a dozen massive corporations doing almost all the manufacturing in each country. And the reason why this happened is any business that didn't do what the government said was either liquidated and amalgamated with other businesses, or the ownership of the business was stripped from the person who owned it and handed over to fascist or National Socialist Party members. So it gives this veneer that there's some kind of market system going on. However, both ideologies believed that this was not the end goal. They believed that this was a stepping stone to total socialism or socialism in everyday life, similar to what Marx considered socialism in his third step of communism. Fascism and National Socialism aimed at socialism as the end goal. They weren't looking for the fourth step of communism, like the commune system or anarchy. So a lot of scholars who don't read into this look at the systems that were set up and said, look, National Socialism and fascism are a system where the corporations and the government merge. And they assume that's what they were aiming for, which isn't the case. So the best way to describe it is to describe it as mid-goal National Socialism. So they weren't to the end goal, they were halfway there. And when we start talking about progressives, this will make more sense. So now we need to talk a little bit about the difference between a liberal and a progressive. In the United States, these two groups are often conflated as being the same thing when they're actually not. Even people who call themselves liberals and progressives confuse the meaning of the words. And the reason that they are confused is at one point, prior to the 1930s, they were two very distinct ideologies. In order to allow FDR to continue his programs, required a political merger of the two groups to where many people today can't even tell the difference between them, but the difference is somewhat important because they're in the actual definition, they're very much different from each other. And we're actually starting to see where the liberals and progressives may be starting to break away from each other. So the best way to differentiate between the two is liberals are for individual liberty and freedom, and that's essentially their end goal. So a progressive is a progressive ideology came out of. What I'm going to do is I'm going to finish the comparison, then I'll tell you a little bit about the background of the progressives. Okay, so in terms of free speech, a liberal would be a free speech absolutist. A progressive believes there needs to be limits on free speech if free speech gets in the way of their idea of progress. So liberals would believe that speech, even speech that offends people, that people don't like, that people don't want to hear, is legitimate. Whereas the progressives would say, well, we have plans, and if your free speech gets into our plans, we're going to make a carve out that prevents it from happening. Ultimately, liberals would look at any problem and say, is the government in the way of liberty coming to the individual? How do we get the government out of the way? Whereas a progressive would always come to the conclusion of, if we have a goal for an individual, it's best to have a government-managed solution to it. They will almost never come to the conclusion that government is in the way of something. So who are these progressives? Well, the progressive movement comes out of the American Civil War. The progressives are literally the children of the abolitionists. The abolitionists were pushing for the end of slavery via any means necessary. From their perspective, they saw that all their methods failed. And then when actual war broke out, the end result, when it was all over, were the slaves were liberated. Because of this, they came to the conclusion that the only solution to slavery was massive government power. So the progressives, being the children of abolitionists, long for some kind of cause that's similar to what their mothers and fathers went through. In order to make their lives have meaning, they come up with a series of causes where they look at things that they believe would improve the individual's way of life. But they've got some kind of interesting mixes in there because it's somewhat classist in nature because progressives uh, aren't necessarily all that friendly to other racial groups other than European, at least definitely at first. And actually, some of their old anti colored people stances still kind of come up in their ideology, but it's more buried, harder to find. So, what the progressives came up with is ideas like uh, enhancing the culture of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant groups of the United States and those who were willing to support that idea. But because they weren't liberals, they weren't looking at getting the government out of the way of these ideas. They were looking at using government to solve these problems. And because they looked at the Civil War in awe as the perfect way to handle things, they saw no limit on the amount of government power to be used in order to advance their agenda. So primarily their idea is any situation, economic, personal, or group, can be better run if it's managed by a group of elite thinkers. So everything they strive for is basically creating some layer of government with college-educated thinkers to basically come up with a better solution than the horrible free market or just letting individual liberty run its course. Because they have that core belief that's it started with the whole white Anglo-Saxon Protestant idea. Although they don't say it in that way, because of the way they built their foundation, they're still following the concept. So they came to the conclusion that the American form of government, as they saw it, not as the Constitution saw it, but as they saw it, was by far the most superior model for the world. And so not only were they needing to manage the lives of all Americans, they wanted to bring this system to the world. And so progressives ultimately want to create a system of world government, but they want that world government to be dominated by United States ideals and individuals. Okay, so that's probably a good place to end that. We have some more elements to work on, and then we'll actually start talking about how we put all these elements together to understand the forces at work in the United States today. If you have any questions about what we went over, or you want something spelled out better, please use the comment section below. I'll either answer you in the comments, or if it's lengthy, we'll make another video on it. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm has brought you here and you're not a subscriber, please look at my content. I'm sure there's something out there that you might find interesting, and subscribe. If you know somebody who might find this interesting, share it with them. I appreciate you spending time with me. Hope to see you again in our next video. I think we'll probably have about 2 more parts of this.